Most climate scientists are not, in fact, scientists, they are activists. That's a pretty controversial statement, but I have proof. If climate scientists were truly driven by the accuracy of the information they present, they would not claim that my dairy cows are killing the planet. That is a lie that is deliberately ignoring science fact. We will get to the why. Why would climate scientists lie about my cows killing the planet? But first, let's examine the claimed carbon emissions from my dairy cows. Climate science claims that per litre of milk, the global average emission is 2.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per litre. To set that in context, a litre of petrol emits less carbon, they claim, than a litre of milk. If that does not ring alarm bells and send up some red flags for you, I'm not sure what will. A litre of naturally produced milk is never going to emit more carbon than a litre of petrol which was dug up from underground and is made entirely of carbon. Climate scientist claims that a litre of milk emits the same CO2 emissions as flying at 600 miles an hour through the air on a jet for 17 miles. When you put it in the context of other emissions, it becomes extremely clear right away that something is not right. Let me explain what that something is. There is a few big fundamental issues when it comes to how climate scientists deal with agriculture. A big one is the scope of the emissions, so what are you including? An example would be that the aviation industry and their emissions only includes the fuel used, whereas whenever climate scientists calculate the emissions from a kilogram of beef, for example, they often even include things like deforestation in Brazil. They include everything they can possibly imagine in the agricultural calculation. However, when it comes to industry like aviation, they include the bare minimum. However, today we are not going to focus on the scope of emissions. We're going to set that unfairness to one side, and we are going to focus on methane. The methane that comes from my cows, which climate scientists claim makes up about 50% of all agricultural emissions globally. So why do cows emit methane? Cows emit methane because they digest grass using bacteria. That all happens in their rumens. That process of breaking down cellulose and fibre that they otherwise couldn't digest emits the methane gas. And when that gas is emitted from the cow's mouth, it is counted in the calculations as a direct emission into the atmosphere. Counted in exactly the same way as releasing natural gas straight into the air from fossil fuels. Now that might sound logical up to this point to you. Both are the same gas, CH4, so both should be counted as an emission equally. However, the source of where that carbon in the CH4 came from is where there is the difference. And that is the big lie from climate scientists. CH4 from natural gas is a carbon atom that was locked away deep underground for thousands of years. The carbon in the CH4 which comes from my cows came from the grass that they eat. And does anyone know where grass gets its carbon from? It gets it from the air. So when it comes to cows, the carbon which ends up in the methane came from the atmosphere in the first place. You may have learned this in secondary school as the carbon cycle. Carbon cycle. It cycles. It goes round. So far we have carbon from the air, to carbon in the grass, to carbon in the cow's diet, to released as carbon in methane. The final piece of that cycle is that CH4 or methane naturally breaks down to CO2 and H2O after about 12 years. So the carbon that was in the methane is then returned to CO2 in the air, ready to be absorbed by plants again, which are then eaten by my cows, continuing the cycle. So where's the lie? What is the claim made by climate con artists? Well, the climate con doesn't take any account of that cyclical process. They take their measurement at the moment the methane leaves the cow's mouth. They record what exits and never account for where it came from. That method of calculation makes sense for fossil fuels because they are deep underground and have been there for a very, very long time. But it does not make sense when you're dealing with a natural cycle like the carbon cycle. And cows are treated totally differently to the carbon cycle elsewhere in nature. The best example is us as humans. I am breathing in oxygen and emitting carbon dioxide. But that is not an emission. And the reason it's not an emission is because that carbon which I emit came from my food. And if it came from my food, it didn't come from fossil fuels, it came from atmospheric carbon. So it is logical, it is not counted. But they treat cows differently. Now, if you're a climate scientist or just someone who buys into this total nonsense, I know what you're screaming at the screen. You're saying, but methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. And you are spot on. It's about 100 times more warming than CO2. However, that does not matter. I have a bucket. This is going to represent our atmospheric methane store. The methane which all of the global cows emit is rising at a rate of 100 methane atoms per hour. And the methane which is breaking back down to CO2 and water is doing that at 100 methane molecules per hour. And if that is the case, my bucket will never overflow. The amount of methane in the atmospheric store will stay the same. So the contribution my cow's methane emissions make to actual planetary warming on a stable animal population, which is what we have, is essentially zero. But it is counted in the calculations as an emission, a one-way, non-cyclical emission, exactly the same way as natural gas released from deep underground. It is not scientific, it is entirely false and is absolute propaganda. And there are climate scientists who say this. There are climate scientists who say we need to address this and fix the calculation system. But it doesn't happen. So why does it not happen? I'm going to go to my lab to answer that question. The current unfair calculation system was developed by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and they have always been heavily influenced by the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry was actively involved in coming up with the calculations which are so unfair against farmers. And the fact that being able to blame agriculture for such a large percentage of global emissions benefits the fossil fuel industry should not be lost on any of us. That is why biomethane from cows ended up being treated in the calculations exactly the same as natural gas. And if you're still in any doubt about what I'm saying, the very organization that came up with these calculation standards has openly admitted there is a big issue around how methane from cows is calculated. But yet, no one has done anything about it. Because the very same people who were advantaged at the very start by using this calculation system still have huge influence. Huge influence because they have huge amounts of money. So whilst the lobbying from the fossil fuel industry and the amount of money they have may explain the flawed calculation system, why do you not hear this from climate scientists? After all, scientists are meant to stick up for the facts. In my opinion, the reason you don't hear climate scientists speak out is because when they do, it ruins their career. They are ostracized by other climate scientists and they no longer have access to very lucrative grant funding. So it is in every single climate scientist's personal interest to play along. And at the end of the day, what are they going to gain by standing up and speaking out? What do farmers have to offer a climate scientist who does that? We can't progress their career and we can't give them funding for research. All of the benefits for climate scientists align with playing along with this lie. But I do think people are starting to wake up. They're starting to realize how unfair the calculation system is. And the sooner that happens, the better. I have spoke about this at length now for 2 or 3 years, including making several videos which have reached a huge audience. And through everything I have said in every one of them videos, I have yet to be fact-checked by anyone. So what I am saying is factually true. It is accurate, and I have said it so many times now that I am 100% confident in what I am saying. It is an absolute disgrace the way carbon calculations are done. It is extremely unfair on livestock farmers, and we are 100% being used as a scapegoat by other industries so they can emit more carbon for longer. And that's not a statement that just comes from me. They openly admit this all the time now, but no one ever picks up on it or challenges them. So what can farmers do to fix this? What can farmers do to save their industry from being sacrificed on the altar of net zero? Put simply, we can understand what is happening to us, and we can refuse to comply based on the unbelievable unfairness in the calculation system. For any farmers out there who have done a carbon audit voluntarily, you're a fool. Do not do that. If you accept the results of a carbon audit that is based on totally flawed science, you're essentially encouraging this lie. You need to refuse to take part. If all of us farmers understand the gross unfairness, we have an argument to say no. We are not taking part in this grand lie. The system needs to be fair and accurate if you expect us to measure our carbon. Companies like AgriCalc are an absolute disgrace. The reason they don't stand up for farmers and instead use the flawed GWP 100 calculation system is entirely because of money. They want a business out of this, and to have a business they have to play along. So that's it. There's my call to action for farmers. Make it as difficult as possible for people to force this nonsense onto you. Understand how grossly unfair it is. Understand that you're being used as a scapegoat by the fossil fuel industry and the aviation industry. And understand that the people who are meant to stand up for you are just falling in line for their own personal benefit. My goal with making videos like this is to make it almost impossible for any organisation to hold a meeting with farmers about carbon. Because if they do, I want the farmers in the room to be angry. To be angry that they are being sold out by individuals who are meant to represent them. Now, I'm not saying you should lose any money by making a stand. If your processor tries to demand you do a carbon audit, play along. But just make sure you punish them for making you do that. If you're part of a co-op, vow to never elect the same people into positions if they make you do it. Whatever voice you have without financially losing money, use it.